November 23, 1942.
A radio message reaches the German 6th Army headquarters in Stalingrad.
The army is surrounded.
Soviet forces have closed the encirclement. 280,000 German and Axis soldiers are trapped in a pocket roughly 30 miles wide. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the 6th Army, requests permission to break out while escape routes might still exist. The answer comes directly from Hitler's headquarters. The army will hold its positions regardless of the danger of encirclement.
Special supplies by air will be arranged.
In military terms, this is a no-retreat order. In human terms, it's a death sentence for most of the army. The order defied military logic. Encircled armies that don't break out face starvation, ammunition depletion, and eventual destruction.
Every German general understood this.
But Hitler's decision was final: the 6th Army would not retreat. This single command, 4 sentences in a radio transmission, sealed the fate of an entire army and became one of World War II's most catastrophic strategic decisions. This is the story of how ideology trumped military reality, and what it cost the soldiers ordered to obey. The Battle of Stalingrad began in August 1942 as part of Germany's summer offensive targeting Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. The 6th Army, under General Paulus, was assigned to capture Stalingrad, a major industrial city on the Volga River. The city's strategic value was significant. It was a key transportation hub and manufacturing center. But it also carried symbolic weight: Stalin's name.
For both dictators, Hitler and Stalin, Stalingrad became a prestige battle neither could afford to lose politically.
By September, the 6th Army had fought its way into Stalingrad's ruins. Street fighting consumed the fall months, brutal house-to-house combat in destroyed factories and apartment buildings. The German advance slowed to meters per day.
Soviet defenders, reinforced continuously across the Volga, contested every building.
By November, the 6th Army controlled most of the city, but at tremendous cost. The army was exhausted, undersupplied, and strung out in a narrow salient. Its flanks were protected by Romanian and Italian Allied armies, less well-equipped and trained than German forces.
Soviet commanders, particularly Marshal Zhukov, recognized the vulnerability.
While German attention focused on Stalingrad's ruins, the Soviets prepared Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive targeting the weaker Romanian positions protecting the 6th Army's flanks.
The plan encircled the entire German force at Stalingrad. November 19, 1942. Operation Uranus began.
Soviet forces attacked the Romanian 3rd Army northwest of Stalingrad. The Romanian positions collapsed within hours under overwhelming artillery, armor, and infantry assault. The next day, November 20th, Soviet forces attacked the Romanian 4th Army south of Stalingrad with similar results.
The Romanian armies, lacking adequate anti-tank weapons and air support, couldn't withstand Soviet armor concentrations.
German units rushed to plug gaps, but the Soviet advance was too rapid and powerful.
On November 23, Soviet pincers met at Kalik, west of Stalingrad.
The encirclement was complete. The entire German 6th Army, part of the 4th Panzer Army, and various Romanian and Croatian units were trapped in a pocket approximately 30 miles across. Total strength, roughly 280,000 Axis soldiers. General Paulus immediately radioed Army Group headquarters requesting permission to break out to the southwest while the encirclement was still fresh and potentially penetrable.
Paulus understood military reality. Encircled armies must break out quickly or face destruction.
Every hour of delay meant Soviet defenses around the pocket grew stronger, escape became harder, and more supplies were consumed.
Wehrmacht doctrine and historical precedent were clear: encircled forces break out. But the decision went to Hitler.
At his headquarters, Hitler faced the most critical choice of the Stalingrad campaign.
Hitler's decision-making was influenced by multiple factors, all of them flawed. First, ideological. Hitler's worldview rejected retreat as weakness.
His no-retreat orders throughout 1941–42 had occasionally prevented panicked collapses, convincing him that willpower could overcome material disadvantage.
Second, strategic. Abandoning Stalingrad meant abandoning the summer campaign's objective and appearing weak before Germany's allies and enemies. Third, Göring's promise. Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring assured Hitler the Air Force could supply the encircled army approximately 500 tons of supplies daily.
This was fantasy.
The Luftwaffe lacked sufficient transport aircraft, winter weather would ground planes regularly, and Soviet air defenses would exact heavy losses.
German military logistics officers immediately calculated that air supply on the necessary scale was impossible.
But Hitler believed Göring's assurance. On November 24, Hitler issued the order: the army will hold the area between the Volga and Don regardless of the danger of encirclement. The order formally designated Stalingrad a fortress, Festung, a military term meaning the position must be held at all costs. This was Hitler's no-retreat command. It reached General Paulus on November 24. Paulus was a capable, by-the-book officer, but not one to disobey orders. Despite his staff's protests that breakout was the only rational option, Paulus obeyed. The Sixth Army would remain encircled and await relief or supplied by air. Both would fail. The destruction of the army began not with Soviet attacks, but with Hitler's command refusing to authorize the only viable option: immediate breakout. The airlift began immediately and failed immediately. The Luftwaffe could not deliver anywhere near the required 500 tons daily.
On good days, perhaps 100 to 150 tons reached the pocket. Often, weather grounded all flights. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire shot down dozens of transport planes.
The needed supplies simply couldn't arrive.
Inside the pocket, the Sixth Army consumed its reserves. Ammunition for artillery became scarce, guns fell silent. Fuel for vehicles was rationed severely, mobility disappeared.
Medical supplies ran out, the wounded suffered without adequate treatment. Most critically, food supplies dwindled.
By December, rations were cut repeatedly. Soldiers received progressively less bread, almost no meat, minimal fats. Horses were slaughtered for food, first supply horses, then officers' mounts, eventually any animal.
Hunger became constant.
Meanwhile, the Soviet ring around the pocket strengthened daily. Multiple defensive lines, minefields, artillery concentrations, the encirclement became impenetrable. In mid-December, a German relief effort, Operation Winterstorm, attempted to reach the pocket from the southwest. Panzer divisions advanced to within 30 miles of the pocket's perimeter.
Paulus requested permission to break out to meet the relief force. Hitler refused. The Sixth Army must hold Stalingrad. The relief effort stalled, then withdrew. The last chance for significant numbers to escape disappeared. The pocket was sealed. The Sixth Army's fate was now only a question of time. Winter deepened. Temperatures dropped to -30°C. Soldiers lacked adequate winter clothing. The autumn campaign was supposed to end before deep winter. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties. Men weakened by hunger couldn't maintain body heat. Frostbite, disease, and starvation eroded the army's strength as effectively as Soviet attacks. By January 1943, the Sixth Army was in catastrophic condition. Soldiers were starving, daily rations had dropped to portions that couldn't sustain life long term. Medical facilities were overwhelmed with wounded, sick, and frostbite cases. Hospitals lacked medicine, bandages, and heat. Men lay in unheated buildings awaiting treatment that couldn't come. Ammunition shortages meant defensive positions couldn't respond effectively to Soviet attacks. The army was dying from within before Soviet offensives delivered the final blows. Soviet forces, meanwhile, prepared to eliminate the pocket. On January 10, Operation Ring began a systematic offensive to crush the encirclement. Soviet artillery subjected German positions to massive bombardment. Infantry and armor advanced methodically, compressing the pocket. The Sixth Army defended but lacked the strength to hold. Each day, the pocket shrank. German casualties mounted, but more men perished from disease, starvation, and cold than from Soviet fire. By mid-January, the pocket had split into two smaller pockets. Organization was breaking down. Units were mixed together, command structure was fragmenting, coherent defense was becoming impossible. On January 30, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, a cynical gesture implying no German field marshal had ever surrendered. Therefore Paulus should fight to the end or perish. The next day, January 31, Paulus surrendered his headquarters group. Fighting continued in other parts of the pocket until February 2 when the last units surrendered. The Sixth Army ceased to exist. The casualties were staggering. Of approximately 280,000 Axis soldiers encircled at Stalingrad, roughly 91,000 survived to surrender. The rest, nearly 190,000 men, perished in the pocket from combat, starvation, disease, and cold. Of the 91,000 who surrendered, only about 6,000 eventually returned to Germany. Most died in Soviet captivity from their weakened condition and harsh camp conditions. The Sixth Army was destroyed completely. Every division was annihilated. Months of combat experience, trained soldiers, officers, equipment, all lost. For Germany, this was a catastrophic military defeat. But it was also an avoidable disaster. Had Hitler authorized breakout in late November when the encirclement was fresh, most of the army could have escaped. Equipment would have been lost, and it would have been a defeat, but the trained soldiers and officers would have survived to rebuild the divisions. Instead, the no-retreat order demanded the army remain in place awaiting relief and supply that never adequately arrived. Military logic dictated breakout. Hitler's ideology demanded standing fast. Ideology prevailed, and the army was destroyed.
The strategic consequences rippled across the Eastern Front.
Germany lost an entire field army, equivalent to roughly 10% of its Eastern Front strength. The defeat emboldened Soviet forces and convinced them Germany could be beaten. Allied nations saw Stalingrad as the turning point, proof that Germany wasn't invincible.
For Hitler, Stalingrad reinforced a dangerous pattern, refusing to authorize retreats or withdrawals even when militarily rational, demanding positions be held regardless of consequences, prioritizing symbolic or political factors over military reality. Hitler's no-retreat order at Stalingrad wasn't an isolated decision, it was part of a pattern that characterized his entire approach to military command. He consistently refused to authorize withdrawals or retreats, even when military logic demanded flexibility. This pattern would repeat throughout 1943–45, armies ordered to hold untenable positions, units forbidden to retreat when encircled, fortresses designated that must be held at all costs.
The consequences were always the same: unnecessary casualties, lost equipment, destroyed units.
At Stalingrad, the cost was an entire field army.
Military historians universally consider Hitler's no-retreat order one of World War II's greatest strategic blunders. An immediate breakout in late November 1942 would have saved most of the Sixth Army's soldiers. They would have lost their heavy equipment and artillery, expensive but replaceable. But the trained infantry, experienced officers, and organizational structure would have survived. These could have been rebuilt into effective divisions within months. Instead, the order to stand fast destroyed everything: equipment, soldiers, organizational structure, combat experience. The Sixth Army was rebuilt only on paper, its combat effectiveness was never recovered. The lesson was clear: ideology cannot override military reality. Willpower doesn't defeat logistics. Determination doesn't create supplies from nothing. Orders cannot make impossible situations possible. Yet Hitler never learned this lesson. He continued issuing no-retreat orders through 1945, resulting in unnecessary disasters across multiple fronts. Stalingrad was the largest and most costly, but not the last. The human stories behind the statistics are what makes Stalingrad's tragedy comprehensible. Every one of those 280,000 soldiers had a name, a family, a home they wanted to return to. Letters sent from the pocket in December and January, carried out on the last supply flights, reveal men who understood they were abandoned. They wrote farewells to families, knowing they wouldn't survive. They questioned why retreat wasn't permitted when encirclement was obvious. They described hunger, cold, and the gradual collapse of hope. These weren't fanatics willing to die for ideology, these were ordinary soldiers trapped by a command decision they couldn't control. Hitler's order destroyed them not because Soviet forces were unstoppable, but because they were forbidden the one option that might have saved them: retreat. The order that destroyed an army. 4 sentences in a radio transmission on November 24, 1942 stands as one of history's clearest examples of ideology's catastrophic consequences when divorced from reality. Military decisions must be based on military logic, not political symbolism or ideological rigidity. When leaders prioritize appearance over reality, subordinate strategic sense to political considerations, or refuse to accept unfavorable facts, the consequences fall on those who must obey. At Stalingrad, 280,000 men paid the price for one man's refusal to authorize retreat. That order, and its consequences, deserve to be remembered, not to glorify or condemn any side, but to understand how strategic decisions determine fates, and why military flexibility matters more than ideological rigidity. The soldiers who froze and starved at Stalingrad died not from enemy action alone, but from a command that valued symbolism over their lives.